gathered all that he could carry, sent the rest by truck, then headed home. While he was in Juneau, the FBI had come through with a criminal profile of the serial killer. The fact that the killer was so prolific meant to Douglas that he could function unnoticed within the community. Someone who worked independently, most likely a business owner. The killer would be an avid outdoorsman, since the bodies were recovered in remote areas of wilderness. Since he preyed on prostitutes, Douglas concluded the killer had difficulty talking to women, had low self-esteem, and grew up feeling like an outcast. Based on killers with similar profiles, Douglas provided a specific characteristic to explain the cause of those feelings of inadequacy. A feature that bore an eerie resemblance to Robert Hansen.
The one that totally blew us all away, I think, is that when they said he's either going to be a stutterer or someone who has a lisp, a speech defect. How do you figure that?
Shout
that was
out,
one of the things that
Mandaragig.
they suggested might show up.
The FBI profile pointed to Robert Hansen, but the depths of Douglas's insight were about to be known. Upon Van Clausen's return, troopers studied the files. The records showed that Hansen had spent 3 years in a reformatory for setting fire to his old high school's bus garage. Based on their work with previous killers, the FBI profilers said the killer would have a history of arson.
You have a boyfriend?
Yes, actually, I do.
Yeah,
The profile painted the killer as a social misfit. Hansen's court-ordered psychiatric reports from his days at the reformatory bore this out.
That's the boyfriend, girl.
Yes, I'm really busy right now, you know.
I don't mean anything like,
His stutter was a social barrier that undermined his self-confidence. Whenever he tried to assert himself, he'd be
I have a
slapped
lot
down.
of work to do, or I'm gonna call security on you.
He never forgot the sting. The profile said the killer would learn to function as a normal member of society, while his perversions festered within. His record showed that in his 30s, Hansen began working at a bakery. He would brag to co-workers about his kleptomania and the sense of power it gave him. He also bragged about his love of hunting. He took great pleasure in exerting power over his prey, stalking it, then wounding it. And he became good at the kill, winning prestigious awards. In 1967, he moved to Alaska to start a new life, and for better hunting. 3 years after moving there, his record showed he was arrested for the attempted rape of a young receptionist at gunpoint. He pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon. A little more than a month later, he was indicted for the attempted assault of an 18-year-old woman he'd followed home.
As soon as the man got to Alaska, he was involved in theft cases. He was involved in abductions. He had psychiatric evaluations showing him to be really unstable and having all kinds of weird sexual fantasies and the rest.
True to the profile, Hansen seemed a respectable citizen, so the courts were lenient. In one case, he claimed to have memory lapses and was given psychiatric treatment and 5 years in a work release program. He abducted one of his early victims outside a coffee shop, took her to a cabin in the wilderness, and raped her at gunpoint. She was 17 at the time.
He told me, of course, if I called the police, that he would hunt me down and kill me. He told me he was a fine, outstanding businessman. He had never mentioned at any point when during the rape time or before or after that he was married, but he said he's a fine, outstanding businessman and that I was just a kid and nobody would believe me.
And he was right. Everything the profiler said about the perpetrator of the serial killings fits suspect Robert Hansen, a truly dangerous man who was passing as a nondescript face in the crowd. While troopers zeroed in on Hansen, they spread out to search for more victims in the Knik River area, where 3 bodies had been found. They believed that the dancers who were still missing may have been buried close to the other grave sites. But troopers came up empty. The area was too large and remote to cover completely. Despite the compelling FBI profile and the past police records, troopers lacked anything tangible to link Hansen to the killings. His police records were too stale, the evidence too circumstantial to hold any weight in a court of law. Investigators hoped that Cindy Paulson could help. She was the only surviving victim to Hansen's current wave of violence. Perhaps she could remember something else from her ordeal. Paulson gave another statement. But this time, she was able to ID one of the guns Hansen had in his possession. Aside from Paulson, Hansen had not been implicated in a rape or abduction for more than 10 years. But in the hopes of strengthening their case and establishing a pattern of behavior, investigators searched for another of Hansen's victims from years earlier, whose experience matched Paulson's. Although this prior victim no longer lived in the area,
Shoutout
troopers
kay
tracked her
sa
down
Sheriola
and asked for her
Karatao.
help.
Bigyan mo nila shoutout.
I had gotten a call from Alaska asking if I would like to maybe help with a conviction for Mr. Hansen. They had explained to me that he had killed, to the best of their knowledge, 7 women. And they explained to me that the last woman had broken free.
She agreed to testify when the time came, but troopers still had a weak case. The troopers felt confident they were on the right track. They didn't have enough to prove that Hansen was a serial killer. According to Anchorage Police Officer Greg Baker, Hansen knew that authorities were onto something.
One morning I was driving by, and I needed to get some donuts for the shift. Mr. Hansen was there, and he had a window that he stood in and decorated cakes and cupcakes and cookies. And I remember watching him. He kept looking up at me, and you could tell he was nervous. And he kept putting frosting on his thumb. And I liked that.
What we'll do is...
Although investigators had Hansen in their sights, they still lacked the evidence to connect him directly to the crimes.
all the information we can possibly...
But because Hansen matched the profile so closely, Douglas flew to Alaska to review the case and to brief the troopers and prosecutor Frank Rothschild on how to proceed with the suspect.
information that's already in front of him to release.
Douglas was confident that Hansen was their serial killer. The hunter was now the hunted.
So the mission was to provide a analysis for them. Does he have the capability to commit a crime like this? And the answer was yes. I believe this prostitute, and I believe he's capable of perpetrating these crimes.
Douglas's idea was to bring Hansen in for questioning while simultaneously searching his house. To obtain a warrant, investigators needed to list specific items they believed to be in the house. They knew to look for the gun that Cindy Paulson described, and the one that fired the bullets found in the graves of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding.
When we come in the room...
That wasn't enough. They needed a home run. Something that would prove Hansen's guilt in no uncertain terms. They asked Douglas if there was anything else to list in the warrant.
Yes, some of the research findings is we're dealing here with a serial killer. And serial killers, it starts off as fantasy. And one of the things to keep the fantasy going after the crime is because they're on the hunt nightly looking for victims, is they take some type of a memento. We call them either souvenirs or trophies, something belonging to the victims.
Douglas helped prosecutors write the affidavit, based on the likelihood of finding mementos mentioned in the profile.
Okay, anything else? I've got those two.
Anything from a piece of the victim's jewelry to a driver's license.
We don't have any...
But a behavioral profile had never been used as the basis of a search warrant in the United States before. Rothschild knew he'd need to back it up with more conventional information.
Obviously, the district attorney's office wanted this search warrant to be bulletproof. They wanted it to be absolutely, positively, without flaw, because they knew this was a big, big case. The last thing they wanted was to have something wrong with the search warrant and have all the evidence thrown out.
The affidavit swelled to 48 pages. The judge granted 8 search warrants for Hansen's property. Now, they just needed Hansen. They had learned his pattern, knew his schedule. On
Teacher
October
Ayla,
23,
shout out.
1983, they went to pick him up at his bakery. But Hansen wasn't there. He'd gotten off to a late start, unwittingly keeping the troopers waiting 20 tense minutes.
Robert Hansen? Alaska Police Sergeant, will you step away from your car?
When asked to come in for questioning, he didn't resist. The interrogation room was ready for him. The goal was to keep him off balance, hoping to elicit a confession and avoid a lengthy legal case. Douglas helped the troopers design the interrogation room for the biggest psychological impact. Crime scene photos and related materials were strewn everywhere for Hansen to contemplate before his interview.
Bliss, shout out.
At the appointed moment, the troopers arrived,
Hello, Mr.
and the
Hansen.
mind game began.
Mr. Hansen?
The FBI coached Rothschild on how to play it.
Ask him questions in a way that would prompt more discussion.
Robert Hansen.
So that's game plan number one. Then obviously we've got all of these cases that have been investigated. And to get him to talk specifically about those, he's trying to search us out. What do we know? So I could see his game plan was to kind of find out what we knew and play off of that. And my game plan, of course, is to find out what he knew.
While Rothschild tried to get Hansen to open up and confess, troopers served the search warrants. Hansen's wife was home. The troopers were extra cautious, videotaping the entire procedure. What they were looking for could be anywhere, even in plain sight. Hansen knew the troopers had access to his police and psychological records. He didn't tell authorities anything they didn't already know. He spoke of his painful upbringing, his strict family, his anger. He admitted to picking up dancers and prostitutes in the early 70s, and how enraged he became when they tried to raise their prices. But he denied threatening any of them. He admitted nothing. While Hansen told his story and his house was being turned inside out, other troopers headed to his bakery and to the airport to search his plane. Both were clean. The house became the focal point of the investigation. A careful search of the upstairs bedroom finally yielded a curious and eerie discovery. An aerial map of the region, peppered with 37 X's. They seemed to be clustered mainly around the area where bodies had been found. But there were dozens more marks than bodies, at least so far. The searches continued up to the attic. Under insulation, the troopers found weapons. Among the items found were a .223 Ruger Mini 14 rifle, like the one used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding, and a wood-handled revolver resembling the one described by Cindy Paulson. Yeah. The search team let Van Clausen know the good news.
Sounds good. These women look familiar? You ever seen
The
them?
net was closing on Hansen, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to talk just yet.
Take another look.
The interview dragged on for hours. It didn't seem like a confession was likely.
I haven't. Never seen them.
While troopers collected the evidence, the case unwound even further. Hansen's friend and neighbors stopped by, curious about the activity. She was stunned by the news, then made a confession that demolished the last of Hansen's story. She told troopers that her husband provided Hansen with his alibi on the night of Cindy Paulson's abduction. He'd lied to protect his friend, not realizing how serious Hansen's charges were. The husband later called police and retracted his statement. Hansen's alibi evaporated. As the search continued, the troopers found the most incriminating evidence so far. Evidence that Douglas knew had to be there somewhere. They found Sherry Morrow's necklace and other personal property belonging to the dead or missing women. They had found Hansen's stash of trophies.
Yeah, this is Baker here.
Investigators called the station. Though they had Hansen where they wanted him, still he wouldn't confess. But they had enough to lock him up on the Cindy Paulson case.
Take your time.
Bail was set at $500,000. Investigators now had time to build their case against Hansen as a serial killer. They called the prior victim to see if she was still on board.
And at that time, they thought he had killed 11 women. And was I still interested in being a witness? They really felt that they may need me because he hadn't confessed.
All right, what you got?
3 points on the map found in his bedroom matched the locations of bodies recovered by the troopers. Another X marked the location of a body recovered by Seward police years earlier. The remaining X's presumably marked the graves of more victims, dozens of them.
Looking at the map obviously was pretty chilling because we believed the map. The map was a body count as far as we were concerned. The man had kept track. He didn't have newspaper clippings. He had the map.
When the troopers believed they had enough to convict Hansen on at least 4 murders, they confronted him and his lawyer with the evidence. Hansen couldn't refute it. He had no place left to hide. Finally, it was time to confess. Time for Hansen to cut a deal. Hansen said he would confess to the murders that could be proven, as long as the trial was given no publicity and that his family be left alone. He demanded that he be imprisoned outside of Alaska when the trial was over. He agreed to show the troopers where more bodies were buried. Investigators called the prior victim to tell her the good news.
The third time they called back and said that he had confessed and they wouldn't need me. So I hung up the phone when we were done talking, got my son off to school, got my husband out the door, and proceeded to fall apart. I started crying. I couldn't stop. I had no control over it. It controlled me. I could see each and every one of those women, how they died, probably hunted down like dogs, wounded and then hunted more.
Admin Erwin, shout out.
In his confession, Hansen described how he would take his victims into the woods and hunt
Admin
them as
Erwin,
prey.
shout out.
Over the dozen years that he lived in Alaska,
Erwin,
he'd raped
shout
more
out.
than 30 women and developed many strategies for capturing them. Once he found a likely target, a solitary woman like Sherry Morrow, he would befriend her and arrange to meet her at a fast food place. If they were dancers or aspiring models, he'd offer to pay to photograph them. He'd arrive early and stay in his car. That way he'd be certain the woman arrived alone and had no one waiting for her in the parking lot. No witnesses. Then he'd go in and meet his new victim. One half of the handcuff was already fastened to the seat. Hansen boasted that snapping the other half onto his victim's wrist while reaching for his gun became like a reflex. Then he would take them home or to a remote motel to rape and torture them. Afterwards, he'd blindfold them and drive or fly them to the outskirts of town until he arrived at a secluded spot, his hunting ground. His habit was to toy with his prey before he made the kill. Hansen confessed that in the summer of '83, he devised what he called his summer plan. He sent his family away so he could bring his victims home. When he was done with them, he'd dispose of them in the wilderness.
Photo 26.
On February 27, 1984, Robert Hansen was convicted of murdering 4 women and sentenced to 461 years plus life with no chance of parole. After his sentencing, Hansen accompanied troopers into the field to find more of his victims, represented by X's on his map. A total of 8 victims were found. Some places on the map went unexplored. Bears scavenged others, scattering the remains. Investigators will never know how many of the 37 X's represented one of Hansen's victims. According to John Douglas, the map might have depicted only a small part of his hunting grounds.
Killers like Hansen will come into contact with a lot of women, but fantasy dresses, style, and so they'll make a decision. Well, this one will live. This one over here will die. I believe he was good for a lot more cases, and I still believe there was a chance that one of the reasons that caused him to go up to Alaska, he was running away from homicides back in the lower 48.
In the United States, an estimated 35 to 50 serial killers are active at any given time. Profiling has made them easier to spot and apprehend. Each time one is captured, investigators learn more about their twisted motivations. An armored car vanished during a routine stop. Carrying nearly $1 million, it was supposed to be impenetrable. Investigators didn't know if the driver was involved or if he had been ambushed. FBI agents and local detectives began to suspect a group of former law officers in the heist. It would take determination and high technology to track the robbers and make them pay for their silent strike.
Money may not be the root of all evil, but for some men, $1 million is enough to justify murder. Even men sworn to uphold the law can sometimes be tempted. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When robbery turned to murder, the FBI would discover that a killer might be among them.
The Arrowhead Mall, Glendale, Arizona. November 28, 1994. At 1:30 p.m., a van pulled up outside a department store at the mall. It was an unmarked 911 call came to the Glendale, Arizona Police Department. They dispatched units to the scene and sent word to the FBI. The nearest FBI field office is in Phoenix, 20 miles from the mall. Because the money in the van was federally insured, the FBI opened a case.
Scanner said that there's been armed robbery.
Agents headed out to the scene. Glendale detectives arrived at the mall first. They began interviewing the courier. He said he had been gone only 4 minutes when he discovered the van and his partner, John McGosh, had disappeared. The courier estimated the amount of cash, checks, and coins in the van to be just over $1 million.
Security guards and this.
Detectives interviewed others at the mall.
Where are your vehicles parked?
None reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. FBI agents soon arrived from Phoenix. Evidence technicians had processed the area. Where the van had been parked, they found a cigarette butt and a pair of broken eyeglasses. The courier confirmed that his partner was a smoker and said the glasses looked like those McGosh needed when he drove. The technicians collected and marked the items as evidence. Detective Tom Clayton is a senior investigator for the Glendale Police Department.
I think the first thought when we saw the van missing was the driver took off with the money and was going to leave town. We also considered somebody could have robbed him. With the glasses laying there, we weren't sure if it's, was it a setup or did something really happen. We explored every possibility we could think of.
Supervisory Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth, now retired, was the lead for the FBI. The investigators organized a search for the van and its driver, believing that whoever took the van would abandon it soon in favor of a getaway car. They dispatched some officers to begin a ground search around the mall. Pilots from the Arizona Department of Public Safety conducted an aerial search. The DPS officers began at the mall, then widened their search in concentric circles, looking for the van in the surrounding neighborhoods. Whenever they spotted a white van, they radioed ground units to follow up. Special Agent Chenoweth and the others knew most armored car robberies are inside jobs or armed ambushes. Witnesses hadn't heard shooting. Perhaps the driver had decided to trade his hourly wage for $1 million.
Certainly, the van is supposed to be locked and the driver inside, and therefore inaccessible. The fact that the van is missing would lead us to initially at least think about the possibility of the guard driver being involved.
Investigators sought more information on the missing driver.
We investigated John McGosh. First off, we started running his name in the computer to see if we could find any arrests or if he had a criminal history. We started through the Wells Fargo file, his employment file, looking for relatives, friends, where he lived.
After securing a search warrant, investigators traveled to his apartment. His landlady let them in. The investigators were looking for evidence that McGosh had planned the robbery. The apartment appeared undisturbed. Nothing indicated he had planned the robbery, or that he was ready to leave town.
You know who this is?
Yes. That's Lisa Jones.
Detectives learned that McGosh had a daughter living nearby in Phoenix.
All right. Does she live here?
Determining her address through DMV records,
John,
they went to interview her.
Glendale Police. Detective Meyer, Detective Clayton. Talk to you for just a moment.
McGosh's daughter described her father as honest and stable. He took his job seriously. Police found others who said the same. McGosh had no criminal record.
Well, right now, your father and your...
Detectives began to consider the 61-year-old grandfather not as a suspect, but as a victim.
John McGosh had a good reputation. We talked to family, friends, relatives, co-workers. He was a person that did not have a lot of requirements in life. Money wasn't a big concern. Based on the background we did on him, we didn't believe he was going to be involved in the crime.
With McGosh eliminated as a suspect, the investigators were back to square one. They needed the public's help.
Certainly when you don't have eyewitnesses, you try and put as much information out in the form of press releases, newspaper articles, things of this nature, in hopes that it would reach somebody that maybe saw something that otherwise had not heard about it.
That afternoon, the FBI and Glendale Police held a press conference.
I wanted to give you an update on bank heist outside the mall earlier. You know,
They released photos and descriptions of the missing van and driver.
as of yet, we have very little.
Anyone who had seen John McGosh or the Wells Fargo van was asked to contact the FBI.
Investigation without assistance.
A reward of $60,000 was posted for any tip leading to the recovery of the money and the conviction of those involved.
Witnesses, anyone who may know where the van is.
Hours later, a 911 call came in from a church in Sun City, Arizona, just outside Glendale. The caller reported a van idling in the church's parking lot. Parishioners arriving for a Monday night bingo game noticed the van, which fit the description in the news reports. License plates and serial numbers confirmed it was the van missing from the mall. Investigators approached cautiously, not knowing who or what was inside. No one was in the driver's seat, but investigators could see the outline of a body on the floor. They tried to open the van, but the armored vehicle was impenetrable, even to the agents.
The engine was going, it was locked, and a cursory examination initially of the inside disclosed the body lying in the center. In order to gain access to the van, of course, we had to call the armored car company.
No one at the church had seen who left the van or what vehicle they used to get away.
Notice anybody else?
Checking the body through the window, police could see blood on the chest near a Wells Fargo badge. There was no sign of breathing. Authorities believed John McGosh had been killed during the robbery. There were no bullet marks on the van's exterior, no broken glass, and no sign of forced entry at the doors. Whoever had hit the van knew what they were doing.
An armored car robbery is a pretty sophisticated crime, and it takes a lot of detailed planning. And so we knew after finding the van and finding the body that we were up against probably some people who had thought this out very well, planned it extensively, and certainly would not stop at murder in carrying this out.
Investigators needed to get inside the van to know what happened. On November 28, 1994, the FBI and Glendale, Arizona police investigated an armored van hijacked from a mall and abandoned in a church parking lot in nearby Sun City. The driver, 61-year-old John McGosh, lay dead in the cab. He had been shot once in the head, but his death was not instantaneous. Technicians noted aspirated blood spatter, indicating McGosh had continued breathing after being shot. Technicians lifted many latent prints from money cabinets in the van's interior. These would be compared to known prints of employees. No foreign prints were found. No hairs or fibers pointed toward a suspect either. Inside the van, investigators found $132,000 in coins. The cash and checks, estimated at $920,000, were gone. The details of the crime suggested that there had been several violent criminals, according to Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth.
After looking at the van, we knew that we were probably dealing with certainly more than one person, because this would be very difficult for one person to accomplish. So we knew we were looking probably at least two or more, and very vicious and violent people who certainly would not stop at anything in order to obtain their goals, which was the money located inside the van.
To Glendale Detective Tom Clayton, the placement of the van outside Glendale city limits spoke to the criminals' understanding of police procedure.
We believed they dumped the van in Sun City to get it out of our jurisdiction into another one, to complicate the investigation and communication of police agencies, maybe hoping we would not be able to link the two things together right away.
During the autopsy of the armored car driver, the medical examiner retrieved several small bullet fragments from the left side of the victim's head. The fragments were too damaged to determine the make of the murder weapon. It seemed like a small caliber, perhaps a .22. The medical examiner found no powder burns on the victim's head. This meant he had been shot from a distance. McGosh's partner said the driver often smoked a cigarette while waiting in the van. Though it was against company policy, he usually opened his door to let the smoke out. Investigators believed the killers knew this and shot him when he opened the door. Because of his experience tracking down elusive criminals, now retired FBI Special Agent Ron Myers was transferred from the Fugitive Task Force to work the case. From the beginning, he knew they were not hunting amateurs.
One of the things they did that made us think that they were professionals was the manner in which they did the robbery. They picked an isolated part of the shopping center where not many people parked, where there wouldn't be many witnesses. They drove through the type of neighborhoods where there weren't many people out during the day, and they picked an empty parking lot of a church that had no one at it during the day.
Go right in here, sir.
Investigators received dozens of calls to their tip line. One witness came forward, claiming to have some information that might be helpful.
You know how they have those
He said he had seen a white van quickly leaving the mall at the time in question. A red pickup truck followed not far behind, but he wasn't sure if the two vehicles were together. Investigators were frustrated that no one saw the actual ambush at the mall.
We couldn't find any eyewitnesses. And when you don't really know what happened, or you don't have somebody that can tell you what maybe transpired with the van, it's a mystery.
With no other solid leads, investigators canvassed the neighborhoods between the mall and the church. Perhaps someone there had witnessed something.
They almost got ran over.
Edward Morgan, a resident of Sun City, recalled that he had seen the van. On the afternoon of November 28th, Mr. Morgan was returning from the post office when he noticed the van.
And Mr. Morgan stopped because he thought they weren't going to stop for the stop sign and was afraid he'd be hit. At that time, he noticed the white van with this red truck shortly behind it, both speeding through the intersection and driving off. And he thought that was kind of unusual, not only the way they were driving, but the way that the red truck seemed to be following the white van.
I think they were doing.
Mr. Morgan couldn't recall details of license plates or the face of the van's passenger.
But I thought of that.
Desperate for a break, investigators wanted to place him under hypnosis to jog his memory. Morgan agreed to travel to Texas with the investigators.
Mr. Morgan.
There they met with a forensic hypnotist. Perhaps under hypnosis, the witness could remember more details about the incident. Statements made under hypnosis cannot be used in court, but some police agencies find it to be a helpful investigative tool. Under hypnosis, Morgan returned to the events of November 28th. He recalled the white van and the man in the passenger seat. Investigators now believe there were at least 3 people involved in the heist, 2 in the van and 1 in the red truck. When asked about the truck's license plate, Morgan was able to remember a portion.
237.
It wasn't much, but it gave investigators a start.
We had to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to run all combinations of those license numbers, and that produced several hundred possible vehicles because Arizona does not have color on their motor vehicle registration. So we knew we were looking for a particular type of truck, but from looking at the motor vehicle registrations, we didn't know what color they were on the registration, which meant we had to do interviews of everybody on the list.
Investigators eventually tracked down hundreds of truck owners. Each was interviewed, but no suspect emerged. With his refreshed memory of the van's passenger, Morgan worked with a police sketch artist. There was no guarantee that the details recalled through hypnosis were accurate, but authorities were ready to try almost anything. The FBI released the drawing to the media.
For nearly a month now, police and FBI have continued looking for suspects in the armored.
The FBI and Glendale, Arizona police believed 3 men were involved in the robbery homicide. Yet, as the end of 1994 approached, they still didn't have suspects. It began to look like the killers might never be found. But the investigators did not know that the suspect in the composite sketch had been recognized. By December of 1994, a month after the deadly hijacking of an armored car in Glendale, Arizona, the investigation had stalled. Investigators believed at least 3 people pulled off the heist. They had a composite sketch of one and little else. Then, on December 31st, the investigators received a call. A Mesa, Arizona detective had been told that a local woman had information about the crime. A background check showed that the woman had a suspended license. This would make it easy to bring her in for questioning without arousing suspicions. The FBI asked local law enforcement to pick her up on the suspended license charge.
We understand that you were driving under
The investigators asked the woman if she knew anything about the armored car robbery in Glendale. She claimed that she didn't have any real information, but she knew someone who did. She told investigators that her friend, Judy Espinoza, had talked to her after the news reports of the robbery. Espinoza suspected that her boyfriend might have been involved.
Are you watching it? Right. Right. They're saying he might be connected to the army.
The woman told the investigators where Espinoza worked. The investigators spoke with Espinoza.
Good afternoon, Miss Espinoza.
They asked her about the robbery, reminding her that interfering with a federal investigation was itself a crime. She agreed to answer their questions. She explained that her boyfriend, James Greenham, who went by the nickname Yoda, had asked her what she would do if he held up an armored car and suddenly had a lot of money. She told FBI Special Agent Ron Myers that Greenham sometimes worked as a bounty hunter and was usually broke.
Jim never had a dime, but the day of the robbery, he came home that night, told her he had to kill somebody, and he had plenty of cash on his person. She told us that Jim did his bounty hunting with a guy named Tim Ring, and that she had been over to Tim Ring's house and noticed several new all-terrain vehicles, jet skis, a new motorcycle, and Tim had made a comment about how she'd never know how much money was in that garage.
The information was good, but it was only hearsay. Investigators needed more solid evidence. Espinoza had kept several rolls of coins that Greenham had given her. The wrappers were consistent with those used by merchants on the armored van's route. More than a month after the crime, the investigators finally had names. They looked into the 2 suspects' backgrounds. FBI Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth was familiar with the name of one of the men. Tim Ring had been used as an informant in other FBI cases.
We had paid him for some information that he had furnished us in the past, and in order for us to get information from informants, you aren't dealing with priests and with good people. You're dealing with bad guys out there, and Ring's a bad guy.
And when you're ready, focus, squeeze the trigger.
Tim Ring and James Greenham had worked as prison guards in Phoenix and now worked bounty hunter jobs together.
Front sight or through the crosshairs.
Both had many hours of firearms training.
Any questions? Okay, Joe.
Ring was an expert marksman.
Fire when ready.
Pursuing bounty hunters would be dangerous.
The fact that these suspects had law enforcement training in their background made the case pretty difficult. For one, they would be schooled in surveillance techniques. If they were looking for somebody following them, they'd know what to look for. They'd know what to expect anybody following them to do. So we had to be very cautious when we were following them around.
The FBI and Glendale police began 24-hour ground and air surveillance. They had to be covert.
If they're looking for air surveillance, they're looking up, Well, we're way over here because we can't see anything if we're right up here. Here, yeah. So we're way over here, way over here.
The agents wanted to see how the pair earned money and how much they spent.
At the time that we were following Mr. Greenham and Mr. Ring around, neither one was gainfully employed that we could tell. They had no income coming in from any legitimate sources, yet we observed them spending a lot of money.
Ring overhauled his truck, and Greenham got a new apartment. Both bought motorcycles. Agents tracked their purchases. It seemed the suspects did not exceed a certain level in order to avoid the attention of the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay. And they always seemed to be careful whenever they spent their money to stay under the $10,000 limit, knowing that if they spent more than that in cash, the expenditure would be reported by the businesses to the IRS.
Investigators continued tailing Ring and Greenham, building a list of associates. They photographed everyone the suspects met. They still didn't know who the third partner was. Glendale detective Tom Clayton hoped surveillance would spot the three meeting somewhere.
We would watch them go to restaurants where they would meet. We would see them go to strip clubs where they met a couple dancers that they knew.
Everywhere they went, the suspects spent a lot of cash, unaware that investigators were watching. Circumstantial evidence linked them to the robbery and homicide. But the FBI and Glendale police still didn't know exactly what had happened and who else was involved.
Admin Chris Mele, shout out. Admin Chris Mele, shout out.
Somehow, the investigators had to get inside the bounty hunter's shadowy world. As the FBI and Glendale, Arizona police continued to investigate a deadly armored car heist, they got a tip from an associate of their two main suspects. Bounty hunter Michael Sanders said that he had cased armored cars with two other men. He believed those men did the Glendale hit without him. Angry at being cut out of the deal, he decided to talk. He gave FBI Special Agent Ron Myers a lead on the third perpetrator.
Sanders came forward to tell us that he thought that Tim Ring and Jim Greenham were involved in this armored car robbery, and that an ex-Phoenix police officer named Fergie, who worked for a camera shop in the Paradise Valley Mall, might be the third man.
Investigators needed to identify Fergie. They reviewed their case photos.
Try to take some pictures of that guy there too.
Surveillance teams had watched Ring and Greenham meeting with a bearded man who drove a Camaro. The car was registered to William Ferguson. Since Sanders said Fergie was an ex-cop, Glendale detective Tom Clayton checked the personnel records of the Phoenix Police Department.
As we investigated William Ferguson's background, we found he retired at 20 years from the Phoenix Police Department, and his retirement was precipitated by some disciplinary problems.
Investigators began surveillance on Ferguson. They saw that the ex-cop met often with the other suspects and was also spending a lot of cash. agents believed they had identified the 3 men responsible for the robbery and murder.
The investigation was affected by the 3 suspects having law enforcement training because we knew that they were going to cover evidence, and they were also known to have firearms training, which made them dangerous to the surveillance officers.
Detectives and agents needed evidence linking the men to the crime. During surveillance, they began trash pulls, confiscating trash bags from the suspects in the hopes that some clues might surface. FBI technicians examined the trash. In rings, they found several 3x5 index cards. Each card had notes detailing armored car routes. Analysis confirmed the handwriting was Ring's. But investigators needed more. They wanted tapes of the suspects discussing the crime. All 3 men had keys to James Greenham's apartment. FBI Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth believed they used the apartment as headquarters.
Timothy Ring was married, had a wife, children, and I think the likelihood of discussions occurring in regards to this armored car robbery at his house were somewhat remote. But we felt that they were occurring at Greenham's residence, so that was the impetus for which we decided to go ahead and proceed and place a listening device inside the apartment of Greenham.
Special Agent Myers was part of the team that entered the apartment to place the bug.
When we opened the door to go in, an alarm went off immediately, at which point we shut the door and exited the area. We had to come back at a later time with an expert in alarms, and when we went in the door that time, we learned that it was just a real simple motion detector sitting on top of the refrigerator, and all we had to do was just flip the off switch. It wasn't anything sophisticated at all.
While the team was inside Greenham's apartment, the detective surveilling Tim Ring saw him leave his house. Ring owned a red truck like the one reportedly seen following the van. The detective trailed behind Ring. After a few turns, he realized where the suspect was headed. Agents were still in the apartment. Tim Ring was headed that way. Ring often went to Greenham's place even when Greenham was out. If he went to the apartment, he would interrupt the planting of the bug.
His license is under suspension. He didn't run his plate.
The team inside needed more time.
I'll pull him over and hold him until you get here.
The detective called in a uniformed officer to stop Ring for speeding. Anything to delay the suspect.
Good evening, sir. What's the problem?
The officer lectured Ring on the dangers of speeding. Detectives wanted to keep him busy while the team finished at the apartment.
Let's go, gang. They're on their way over. Okay. Put everything away. Let's get this thing back.
They made it out just before Ring arrived. Investigators also tapped the home and cellular phones of the 2 other suspects. to get them talking, Supervisory Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth released false information about the case.
We decided to make a press release talking about the investigation, which we thought when they would hear would certainly generate some telephone conversations and other discussions amongst these three suspects. And it did have its desired effect in that they did talk about the information that we released and how accurate they thought it was, and whether or not we were on the right trail, and whether or not they thought we were getting close to them.
As the suspects talked, the investigators listened.
We didn't get an actual confession where they said, I did the armored car robbery. What we got were several conversations among themselves about different aspects of the case. They would always listen to the news, follow any printed reports or follow any television stories, and as soon as anything would appear on TV, they'd call each other, and they'd make comments like, well, this isn't the way it happened. You know, they'll never find that license plate.
The evidence against the suspects was building.
Man, you seen Judy lately?
But prosecutors wanted more direct statements about the crime before they ordered arrests. Investigators provoked the suspects one more time. A Glendale detective went to James Greenham's apartment when the suspect was out. On the door, he left his business card with the note, Lead 173. Investigators watched Greenham's response to the card. He knew what the note meant. The authorities considered him a lead. Greenham became distraught. He sped away from his apartment, calling Tim Ring on his cell phone. Agents kept watch from an airplane and listened in on the phone taps.
Tim, man, listen.
Greenham drove out into the desert before stopping.
Business card in my door.
Look, man, they ain't got nothing on you. Don't worry about it.
Ring tried to calm Greenham down, promising that the authorities had nothing on them.
Everything's don't worry about it.
But Greenham said he was scared.
I can't do this anymore.
He even threatened to commit suicide.
Just don't do something.
Finally, Ring talked Greenham down, convincing him the authorities were not on to them.
If I see one more cop,
Greenham said that if another cop contacted him, he was going to bury the money. It seemed a direct reference to the crime.
Sam 40.
Investigators felt they finally had enough evidence.
Greenway and 6th Avenue. Continue to search northbound.
They sent units to arrest Greenham and Ferguson.
Jim Greenham was arrested by one team. William Ferguson was arrested by another and attempted to resist arrest but was quickly subdued. Tim Ring was lured down to the FBI office on the premise of looking at some photographs because Ring had previously offered to help the FBI try to find who these people were, which we believe was an effort on his part to try and find out what we knew.
The FBI agent who had previously used Ring as an informant called the suspect.
Good. Hey,
Ring agreed to come in.
Need to look at.
On February 16, 1995, Tim Ring arrived at the Phoenix FBI field office. Undercover agents were waiting for him in the lobby. They believed he would not be armed at the FBI office, but they couldn't be positive.
"25 years of martial arts expertise, who came up and blocked him in the head and knocked him down like a sack of potatoes before he knew what he was doing."
Nita, shout out. Admin Albic, shout out.
All three suspects were off the streets. Now investigators needed physical evidence to make sure the prosecutions were successful. On February 16, 1995, after arresting 3 men for an armored car robbery and murder, FBI agents and Glendale, Arizona detectives searched the suspects' residences.
This couch over here after that. I think I got something here.
At the house of Tim Ring, suspected leader of the 3, they found important evidence. Investigators recovered a note marked with the initials F, Y, and T. Each initial had a number beneath.
Looks like serial numbers from
The numbers added up to the amount of cash taken from the armored car. Agents believed F stood for Fergie, Y for Greenham's nickname Yoda, and T for Tim. It was the worksheet the 3 used to divide the money. In the garage, investigators found a red pickup truck that resembled the vehicle seen by witness Edward Morgan in Sun City. The license plate number, however, did not match the ones Morgan recalled under forensic hypnosis. Ring kept several weapons and plenty of ammunition at his house. In a duffel bag, agents also recovered $270,000 in cash. Another $64,000 was found in Ferguson's house.
We need to count all of it.
Nearly $600,000 in cash had been stolen. Noting the money spent by the suspects, investigators found that about $100,000 was unaccounted for. The case against the 3 suspects seemed solid. FBI Special Agent Ron Myers hoped the evidence might get one of them to roll.
We finally got first-hand information about this crime when Jim Greenham decided to cooperate. Jim Greenham was the only one of the 3 of them that showed any remorse about what they had done, about how they had killed this driver. Jim decided to cooperate. He told us what happened. He told us all the parts that these individuals played in the robbery.
Greenham met with the investigators and explained that the planning started in the fall of 1994.
First night just watched when
Tim Ring had the idea to hit an armored car.
I wasn't crazy about the fact that he was going to kill him. What were you planning on
So they began to case Wells Fargo vehicles. They drove around Glendale, following different trucks and vans on their routes. Then they zeroed in on the van driven by John McGosh, tailing it for days.
They managed to observe this one particular armored car making several stops, and they noticed that every time the messenger would get out to make a delivery, the driver would open the door about 8 inches to smoke and blow the smoke out the side of the door. They observed the driver at several stops, and they noticed this one particular stop on the back side of a shopping center, and noticed that he always parked in the same position.
94. Tim Ring.
On November 28, 1994, the Monday after Thanksgiving, a day they were sure a lot of money would be in the van,
I was just
they were ready to strike. James Greenham and William Ferguson waited unnoticed by the store. They watched until the courier was out of sight. As if on schedule, McGosh opened the door to smoke. Tim Ring was parked 50 feet away, a stolen license plate on his truck. The expert marksman had a silencer on his .22 caliber rifle, so no one would hear the shot. He aimed through the opening and fired once. The force must have knocked McGosh's glasses to the ground. With the driver down, the van was unprotected. No one noticed the vehicle's speed away. They drove to the church parking lot. It would be empty at that time of day. They transferred the money and checks to the pickup. They knew authorities would be searching for the van. They left most of the coins and went to destroy the checks and other evidence, according to Detective Tom Clayton.
They loaded the money into Tim Ring's truck and drove out in the desert where they separated the money, changed clothes, and burned all the evidence.
We buried the license plate.
Greenham said they buried the burned evidence and stolen license plate in the desert.
And you can take us to where the plates are buried? Yeah.
Special Agent Stephen Chenoweth wondered if it was the plate witnessed by Edward Morgan.
We went out there and actually found the location and then dug it up and found that the three numbers actually on the plate did in fact match those that were given to us by Mr. Morgan. So he was actually right on his information.
James Greenham pled guilty to second-degree murder and armed robbery and is serving 27.5 years. William Ferguson pled guilty to armed robbery and accessory after the fact and is doing 17 years. On December 6, 1996, Tim Ring was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and burglary.
Anytime that you have somebody actually assassinate a driver like this, it's a very heinous crime, and you certainly want to expend all of your resources in an effort to identify the people involved and put them behind bars.
For his crimes, Ring received the death penalty. He currently awaits execution at the Arizona State Prison in Florence. New York City's Mafia, an organization of brutal gangs. To gain wealth and power, members strong-arm businesses and kill anyone in their way. John Gotti was one of organized crime's fiercest members. He wanted to rule New York City. The FBI had to stop him.
John Gotti was ambitious, powerful, and ruthless. He ruled with flash and conspicuous style, playing celebrity with the media and cat and mouse with the FBI. They called John Gotti the Teflon Don. Serious charges just wouldn't stick. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When John Gotti came to power in 1985, organized crime still had its tentacles spread into many legitimate businesses. Like a game of chess, crime bosses were well insulated by layers of pawns. The FBI's job was to penetrate their defenses and capture the king.
New York is the home of organized crime in America. Through intimidation, terror, and murder, the five families that make up New York's mafia have corrupted labor unions, run extortion rackets, and infiltrated almost every major industry in the city. Disputes among the crime families often erupt over who controls which union or what industry. These disputes are inevitably and violently resolved. By the 1970s, the Gambino family had emerged as the most violent and the most powerful crime family in the nation. As that decade came to an end, the FBI decided it was time to stop the mafia's reign of terror. The Bureau's New York office set up 5 squads assigned to investigate and bring down each criminal family. Special Agent Bruce Mao was assigned to supervise the squad responsible for bringing down the Gambino family.
The Bureau realized that we really weren't addressing organized crime here in New York, and so they formed squads to target each particular crime family and try to address the organized crime problem here in New York. So in 1980, we formed the squad, and our target was to put the Gambino family in jail.
Yeah.
The boss, Paul Castellano, and his underboss, Neil Della Croce. Castellano assumed leadership of the family in 1976, when Carlos Gambino, the namesake of the family, died of natural causes. The FBI were also targeting the most powerful captain.
Timothy, shout out.
John Gotti. The captains controlled crews of soldiers who carried out the day-to-day criminal activity for the family. Castellano's crews would commit the act.
Shout out,
but
Ate Mavi.
Castellano himself did not. Catching him seemed impossible. As the FBI soon learned, the entire hierarchy of the Gambino family was well insulated.
Dinilit ko na lang yun kasi nakuha na ko. Dinilit ko, nakuha na ko yun na ano ba? Nawala na yung kuhan ko yun. Trip ko kasi yun, tapos parang nahiya ako ba? Dinilit ko.
But federal racketeering legislation was passed that made ordering criminal acts as much of a crime as committing the crime itself. In order to successfully prosecute the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the FBI had to secretly get them on tape.
Wala kasi di ba, trip kong kumanta ng Sintonado, tapos maya nawala yung trip ko. Parang sabi ko nahiya ako, dinilit ko agad. Ulaw ko ba, naulaw ko. Basta mawala na akong trip, maulaw na ko. Delete tweets oh.
Agents tried to learn more by speaking to residents in the neighborhoods where mob activity was prevalent.
You sure now? Yeah. Well, take a look. You might recognize
So, lagi trip man to na ako magkuhan, magkanta-kanta. Magkanta-kanta og kayabag lang wa. Wala sa tono. Kaso pagkawala na sa akong trip, wala na, ulaw na.
Betraying the mafia meant certain death. Informants would be difficult to come by. But some were willing to take the risk. Most were low-level criminals cutting deals with the government to avoid prosecution and long prison sentences. Whatever their motivation,
Tulog muna ako siguro. Ang sakit ng ulo ko talaga. Grabe, sobrang sakit ng ulo. Ay, kanina pa ako. Ilang oras na ako gigaling pag-uwi. Mag 4 hours na ako mula pag-uwi. Hindi pa rin ako nakatulog. Sakit na ng ulo.
Louis Shilero, head of the FBI's New York office, is an expert on organized crime.
One of the most influential things that the Gambino family did was the control of the labor unions in New York City. They exerted at one time tremendous influence in terms
Nita
of
Bustanan, shout out.
in terms of construction industry, trade unions, and in terms of the Teamsters and trucking.
Hindi iba yung si Tico ate.
The Gambino family was able to control.
Si Tico matagal na rin yan sa live buhay.
Had a great influence in the garment center, and that generated tremendous.
Dili oy, grabe ha po day.
To the family.
Ate Mapi, grabe po day.
Castellano.
Ako, si Turag.
Castellano also realized how important
Lahi nagnaw.
ruled by fear and terror, so he had several enforcement arms of the family. He had a crew that was famous.
Si Tico, parang murag nato sa Dubai.
Remembering bodies and doing all sorts of horrid things. So even though Castellano was known as a businessman's don, he was a tough guy. He had a hair trigger and temper, and he'd kill you at the drop of a hat.
Ilonggo man to si Tico, ako Bisaya man ko.
His home in Staten Island was a fortress under constant.
Oh, bago lang gyapon to.
He had also installed a sophisticated alarm system.
Ako kaya medyo nasuod man ko nimo kay sige man kagtambay sa akong live sa una, magbaklay-baklay ko. Antod gikapoy mo ko sa YouTube. Ngik kalain. So gikapoy ko sa YouTube.
For a phone wiretap inside the home. Agents hit the streets. They hope to find one
Parang baka tinamad din yun.
person in the family who made himself vulnerable to electronic surveillance.
Ako gusto ko umalis pero minsan gusto kong tigil ang YouTube pero minsan naaaliw din kasi ako eh. Hindi mo naman matigil ang YouTube eh kasi yun na yun kasanayan ngayon sa buhay. Kahit wala kang content, manunood ka pa rin naman ng YouTube. Yung mga nakilala mo, dadaan yun sa'yo eh. Marami rin namang mababait dyan. Daghan na po mga buutan, na po yung mga maayo, di ba? Bisan pag umiingon ka nga, dili na ako mag-YouTube, hindi na ako mag-content, hindi na ako mag-vlog. Lantaw, maghiham mo kag-YouTube.
And Angelo was an attractive target because number one, he's very active, involved in a lot of criminal activity. Number two, he had a big mouth. He talked a lot. He was a gossip and a blabbermouth.
Nawala kasi kaya dili
every person who entered the Bergen Club.
Hindi ako, wala man ko nasayangan, iundang ako dili. Wala ako nasayangan. Sa ako alang wala ko nasayangan pero mas nasayangan ko sa mga tabang ba. Sa mga tao nga ni tabang, mo na makaingon ko sa nga may pagwa na lang ko nagsugod para walay masayang. Kay sayang man ang ipang tabang kundi magpadayon. Pero wala lang, laag-laag lang akong buhaton ani, lingaw-lingaw, support sa makita, mag-support. Siyempre Ate Mapi, support permi. Support ko permi basta makaakuan ko. Balo naman kapag ay mong live kay alas 4 mo na diri. Mong live alas 4 sa kadlawon. Siyempre ako kabalo gyapon ko kinsa tong mga tawo nga maayo. Kaso sa kadaghan dili po na ako makuan tanan. Kanjing maayo daw.
And that the wiretap is likely to produce more evidence. If conversations are not of a criminal nature, the
Aso di ako mahurot tanan. Hey, magkuhan nun sad nako naman sa mga butang-butang diri nga kinahanglan pagbuhaton. Kung puro sa tanan YT na man sad tay mga mamiss nga mga butang nga importante. Siya.
The wiretapping of Ruggiero's phone proved to be one of the most successful wiretaps in FBI history. The conversations overheard by the FBI were damning. But agents learned that Ruggiero also held meetings in his home with
wala pa akong pin ay mut karon sa to nakalimot ko karon sa ato ulaton ako gigamit akong number sa akong manghod bunso na mo wala man to na reply amot tapos sulaton to na ako pero kung nakabalo ko nga kinahanglan na itong pin pagkamuni na ako.
Are you there?
Pero kung kabalo ko nga kuan dito ang pin, importante dito pagkamuni nako, ako tong giasikaso akong pin. Kaso wala man ko kabalo. Kaso ko kabalo nga importante ang pin.
Kabalan ka na nga ginahasol ta ka, di ba? Na
Angelo Ruggiero became paranoid that his house was bugged.
Pagkagitapulan ako sa YouTube, wala na ako. Sagdaan ako. Wala man na pwede. Importante man ang pinde. Dapat ay ako nagtinapulan. Ay ako kapuyon. Dapat giuna doon akong pin. Na timing man gusto ko nga na ako'y klase. Trabaho pa ko kapoy ko ba. Hamdog wala ako ka. Yes, Lord. Oh, God.
Yeah, I need someone to come sweep my house, please. Ruggiero ordered the sweep on a tapped telephone. When the FBI heard the conversation, they knew they had a crisis. 2345 Street. The phone tap inside the
Oh, nag-apply na ko, te. Nag-apply na ko. Naato siya ikuan. Nag-apply na ko. Nag-i-address na ko sa balay, sa Pinas. Tapos, ibutan ako numbers akong manghod. Murag, kuan ko nag-apply. August. Sa pizza karon, June, July. August na karon, di ba? August. Sa pizza karon? Ang pizza karon kay nakalimot na ko sa kalabad sa akong ulo sa itong ulo kan say karon August 12 na nakalimot to karon sa ako nag-apply kay taon to nako basta nag-apply ko August 13 taod unya pa mag August 13 diri diha siguro August 13 na siguro mga pero saan ako nag-apply? Makita to na ako sa email. Nantaon ako sa email, be. Para sa ako nag-apply. Admin Chris Mele. Mega love shout out. Advance kasi dito. Advance diag oras. Unya pa man diri. Alas 9 pa sa gabi diri. 9:04. Tanawon ako sa email kung kanos ako nag-apply og pin. Limtano naman kay ko. Tigulang naman ko. Wala ko may numduman. Pila na edad nako 50 naman ko hapit na ako sa 60 mag-email naman yun si Lolo sa'yo pero mabasa po na akong email kung kanus ako ato nag-apply limtano naman kay ko ango naman ko year August pangitaon to na ko action verify August 1 siguro ko nag-apply so naka 12 days na ko murag August 1 ko nag-apply tanaw na ko naman to kuan dire a time of joy a time of peace a time when sun will set me free a time tanong to na ko makita dapita ba lagi limtano na bitaw ko tinuod di mo ko magkuan angkon man ko limtano ko samot na siguro kapoy tapos ganina pa ko gusto matulog alas 9 na sakit yung ulo igo katulog problema na ako asa mo na ako makita shout out hello yahoo but I always thought you were the best. I guess I always will. Murag ko niya.
Parang pin mo ha.
July 30. Ayog saba kay na ko gibuhat. July 30. July 30. So pasabot
Pero parang naka 20 KD ha para magpuloy mo nga imo nga $100. Tapos kuno ni mo imong pin.
Ayaw pag sayang og kwarta kay sayang kay na mawala ra na hindi na kinahanglan. Feeling the blog, shout out. Rose's blog, shout out. Kailan ba ako nag-apply noon? Nag-apply yata ako nung August 1 yata ako nag-apply. Thank you sa pagtamsak, Philinda Belong. Hindi pala to Philinda Blog, Philinda Belong. Shout out, Philinda Belong. Asan na ba yung kailan ako nag-apply? Makikita ko yun dito sa kwan. Makikita ko yun dito sa mag-email yan si Lolo kung kailan nila ipadala ang pin mo. Ate, nag-email na sila, hintayin. May sinabi yun kung kailan ko hintayin, kaso hindi ko na makita Baka dinilit ko na naman yun, lagot. Tigulang, magsige ako pang delete dire. Basin delete na to na akong email ni Lolo. Na-delete na ako makita, bay. Kitas likod Kaluoy mo na ako. Let's get you started. Nasa giingon na to nga hulaton ako. Gisi, asa man ta ni? Tingnan natin. July 30. August 1. Hindi, ang sabi dito pala, we mailed you a pin on August 1, 2022. It should take 2 to 4 weeks to arrive. Verify your address by entering pin we sent to you. 2 to 4 weeks from August 1. So, pang 2 weeks niya sa August 15. Hapit na. Kaloy intawon sa tigulang. Sakit ng likod na ko. Ambot na ako. Sakit. August 15, 2 weeks na ako na siyang tawagan na ako ang manghod. Hindi mo ito reply na ako. Busy siguro to. Joy.
Not only had their bugs not been discovered, but now Ruggiero felt confident to speak freely in his house. And he did so with abandon, right into the FBI microphones. Slowly, the FBI was getting closer to the Gambino family hierarchy. To agents, the conversations were a gold mine. As Ruggiero met with his mob partners, the FBI learned of a major heroin trafficking operation conducted by Ruggiero and John Gotti's younger brother, Eugene. Over a 6-month period, Angelo and Eugene Gotti had distributed over 50 kilos of heroin in New York alone. The FBI had every last detail on tape. There was a mafia rule in effect that dealing drugs was strictly prohibited. The punishment for getting caught was
Mutry sa kog piyong kay kuan. Ati Mapi.
no appeal, no trial.
Sa piyong sa gamay kay
Ruggiero did not have the boss's permission to deal drugs.
para uli-ulian na ma-relax kamay ba. Perting inita sa kusina guba ang aircon sa kusina niya. Broiler ba? Sus. Usahay musiga pa. Musiga pa sa mga fat sa giluto. Pati inita wala aircon. Guba ang aircon sa trabaho. Mga maintenance samot dugay na nila giayo wala gyud na ayo. Makadugang isa sa kapoy bakit pati inita.
His name was not mentioned in the tape conversations.
Ma-dehydrate pagig ka kay sus pati inita gyud tinod lang.
Soon find out that Gotti's men were dealing drugs. Learning of the heroin operation, however, was not the only valuable piece of information learned by agents. Just prior to his
Matulog ka ate kasi kuan.
Ruggiero would meet with other soldiers and discuss how he and John Gotti
Ayun pala yun din yung problema kasi sobrang busy hindi ako makainom ng tubig. Pati dito.
What happened in Paul's house?
Dehydrate sa sobrang init.
This guy, everything in the family we found out through Angela's big mouth. And the next day, other soldiers come over. Of course, Angela to reconstruct what happened again. So we found everything was happening in the Gambino family, thanks to Angela Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Paul Castellano.
Based on the Ruggiero wire, agents now had probable cause to bug the house.
Hala ka sa'yo ni Mata.
Getting into Castellano's house took detailed planning and methodical execution. Agents managed
Dili ba maabot ang pin kung dili makaabot og $100? Maabot man di ba? Bisan walay $100, maabot man ang pin. Pag maabot na ng pin ako, pwede na pasagdan. Basta mag-support lang ko, balag wala may content. Tulog lang.
Castellano would meet with his most trusted captains to discuss business. The FBI identified one of those captains as Sammy the Bull Gravano. As his nickname implied, the Bull was both strong and aggressive. He was a boxer and a bodybuilder. He was also the family's top enforcer. Gravano generated his money for the family in the construction industry. He was adept at a number of criminal activities, but his most notorious skill was murder. As the FBI continued to investigate powerful captains in the family like John Gotti and Sammy the Bull, their sights remained focused on the boss. In 1985, 2 years after Ruggiero was indicted, Paul Castellano was arrested and charged, along with other New York family bosses, with dozens of federal racketeering and conspiracy violations. Out on bail, Castellano continued to run the family, though his attention seemed focused on how to beat the government's case against him. John Gotti was also facing his own legal troubles. An independent investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office ended with Gotti and his mentor, underboss Neil Della Croce, being charged with several counts of racketeering. Della Croce and Gotti were released on bail, allowing them to continue their criminal operations.
Thank you for watching. Shout out. Bye-bye.
Della Croce lay dying of cancer. The FBI had bugged his bedroom.
Patayin ko na ito. 2 hours ko muna. 2 hours ko. Matulog na ako. Hayaan ko na lang to.
They recorded Gotti talking about
Sige, Ate Mapi, salamat. Thank you, thank you.